They called it an auction, but everyone in Dry Creek knew it was a public humiliation. Josie Harper orphaned crippled leg, and no protector stood on the block as the crowd jeered. Then a man stepped forward. Cash Mercer, a reclusive rancher with nothing to prove, bought her with $10 and a look that silenced the street. Neither knew it was the start of a fight for survival, and a bond the harsh West couldn't break. The wind didn't just whistle through Dry Creek that afternoon, it prowled. It moved low and mean, dragging grit across the wooden planks of the boardwalks, rattling loose shutters and carrying with it the faint tang of sweat and horse. The main street stood half empty, save for a knot of townsfolk gathered at the center, where the auction platform rose like a gallows. It was built for livestock sales, but today no cattle were penned. Today, there was only a girl. Josie Harper's bare knuckles clenched at her sides, her nails biting into the flesh of her palms. The faded cotton of her dress clung to her thin frame, streaked with dirt, that looked older than the day. She kept her eyes fixed on the boards beneath her feet, refusing to give the crowd what they wanted. The weight of their stares was a familiar burn, the same heat she'd felt since she was left to fend for herself, the same heat that had taught her to keep her head down, and her words sharper than most liked. Her offense was no crime the law recognized. She was guilty of being alone, an orphan in a town that didn't have use for such burdens, a girl with a crooked leg who survived when others hadn't. For years she'd scraped by on the scraps of grudging charity and her own stubborn will, but even stubbornness ran thin. Now the mayor, with his slicked hair and greasy smile, had decided she would be reassigned a polite word for being sold to whoever could make use of her labor. Mayor Rutledge stood at the edge of the platform, cigar clenched between yellowed teeth, his eyes sweeping the crowd for bidders. "Not your usual prize gentleman," he called the words, oiled to slide between mockery and salesmanship. "But she's young, healthy enough, and I reckon she can pull her weight if you put her to it." A ripple of laughter rolled through the onlookers. Josie swallowed hard against the sting in her throat. She wouldn't cry here. Not in front of them. Then a voice cut across the noise, low, measured with the kind of weight that made men listen. How much heads turned. A tall figure stood near the old watering trough, his shadow stretching long in the dust. Cash Mercer. The name traveled on whispers in this part of the territory, a rancher who kept to himself, a man carved out of grief and weather who hadn't set foot in town for months. Rutledge blinked, caught off guard. "Mercer, didn't think this was your kind of business." "It ain't." Cash said, his gaze fixed on Josie. "But I'll take her." The mayor's eyebrows lifted in surprise. $10. Cash only. Without another word, Cash reached into his saddlebag, drew out a small pouch, and tossed it so it landed at Rutledge's boots. The sound of coins striking wood was louder than any jeer. Josie dared to look up. Their eyes met. His held no pity, no false kindness, only something solid like a promise she didn't yet understand. "You'll come with me," he said. The words weren't sharp, but they allowed no room for argument. For a moment, she stood rooted, unsure if she was stepping into a cage of a different shape. But the laughter had stopped, and the crowd's gaze had shifted. So she stepped down from the platform, her limp barely noticeable in the churned dirt, and followed the man who had bought her. Not as property, she told herself, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, as something else. The wind shifted as they left the street, carrying away the sound of the mayor's voice hawking the next lot. Ahead lay the canyon road and the wide, empty prairie beyond. Josie didn't know what waited for her there. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't walking into it alone. Cash Mercer's ranch lay a good half-day's ride from Dry Creek, tucked into a bend of the canyon where the wind came low and the land spread wide in shades of gold and rust. By the time they arrived, the sun had slipped behind the ridge, leaving the prairie washed in the deep blues of oncoming night. Josie hadn't spoken the entire ride. Her hands stayed knotted in the worn leather of the saddle, as if letting go might send her tumbling back to the place she'd left. Cash swung down first, tying off his horse to the rail. He didn't offer his hand, not out of meanness, but because he could tell she didn't want it. She climbed down on her own, wincing as her crooked leg took her weight. Her eyes darted to the shadows of the yard, the small barn leaning against the wind, a chicken coop. Quiet for the night, the dark outline of a cabin built from heavy timbers. Inside the cabin smelled faintly of cedar smoke and leather, with the dryness of a place long kept to one man's habits. Cash lit a lamp, its yellow glow pushing back the gloom, and showed her the narrow cot near the stove, the wash basin on the porch, and a small shelf in the pantry where she could keep whatever was hers. "You'll be safe here," he said simply. Josie only nodded, her gaze sweeping the corners of the room like she was looking for something hidden or making sure nothing dangerous was there. Cash noticed, but didn't press. He'd had enough people press him in his own time, and it had never made him speak faster. That first night, neither of them slept much. Josie lay rigid beneath her thin quilt eyes, tracking the firelight's flicker on the wall. Cash sat at the table in the dark, listening to the small sounds she made when she shifted sounds that reminded him more of a cornered animal than a girl. The days that followed slid into a cautious rhythm. At first, Josie kept to the edges of the yard, trailing after him when he worked, but never too close. She watched him mend fence posts, toss hay to the cattle, and carry feed to the barn. Sometimes she lingered by the corral, her fingers curling through the rails as if testing the feel of wood that didn't cage her. It was Cash who noticed the small ways she started to move around the place. A broom leaned differently in the corner after she'd passed through. Shirts he'd left piled on a chair appeared folded on the table. One morning, the hearth was swept before he came in from the barn, and she was sitting nearby with her knees tucked under her chin, staring into the embers. Once he heard a faint sound as he came in from the field, humming. Low, almost hesitant, like a memory she wasn't sure she was allowed to keep. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes dropping back to her work. He didn't say a word. Some things he knew were better left to come back on their own. Josie was quick to startle. The caw of a crow overhead, the snap of a dry branch under his boot, each could make her spine go stiff. The day he cursed at a stubborn mule and his voice cracked sharp, she flinched so hard she nearly dropped the pail she was holding. Cash caught himself mid-curse, finished the chore in silence, and later brought her a cup of coffee by the stove without saying why. Bit by bit he spoke more. He'd point out the thin sliver of moon in the sky, tell her the names of stars, or explain how you could tell if a calf was sick by the way it held its head. He didn't expect answers, but every now and then she gave them. One afternoon, he found her kneeling in the patch of ground behind the cabin, her hands buried in dirt so dry it broke apart under her fingers. She was digging without a tool, her nails black with soil, her face set in quiet stubbornness. "You know that dirt's not likely to give you much," he said, leaning on the handle of the shovel he'd carried out from the barn. Josie didn't look up. "It doesn't have to be much," she said. "Just enough." Cash studied her for a long moment, then stepped forward and handed her the shovel. "Here. Might as well do it right." She took it without a word, and by evening she'd turned over a small square of earth. Later, when she came in for supper, she found a small tin of bean seeds beside her bowl of stew. He didn't mention them. Neither did she. That night she slept a little deeper. It wasn't friendship yet, not in the way stories told it. It wasn't healing either. But it was something, the first stretch of ground they both seemed willing to stand on without retreating. In the quiet, in the work, in the way neither of them demanded what the other wasn't ready to give, there was a fragile start, a beginning that didn't have to announce itself to be real. The morning started quiet with the kind of stillness that made a man think the world might just leave him in peace for a while. Cash was repairing a section of the corral fence, sweat dripping down the back of his neck, the hammer's thud carrying across the yard in steady rhythm. Behind him, Josie knelt by her patch of garden, pulling weeds with her hands and humming under her breath, a sound he'd begun to notice more often lately. The air was warm, the sky a clean blue, and for once the ranch felt like it belonged to both of them. Then the sound came. It began faint, a low tremor in the earth, a rhythm Cash knew too well. Hooves. More than one. He straightened slowly, wiping his brow with the back of his wrist, his eyes scanning the horizon. Josie froze mid-motion, her fingers tightening around a stalk of ragweed she'd been pulling. The hum of insects went sharp and distant in her ears, replaced by the drumming of horses drawing closer. 3 riders appeared over the rise, the lead man's outline unmistakable even from a distance, broad through the shoulders, his posture dripping with the kind of arrogance that didn't come from strength so much as entitlement. Benton Hayes. Cash had seen his type 100 times, men who measured their worth in what or who they could own. Hayes wore a dusty gray coat, the cuffs stained with sweat, his curled mustache gleaming under the sun. Flanking him were 2 long-limbed riders with hard eyes and restless hands. All 3 slowed their approach, letting the dust from their horses roll ahead of them like a warning. Hayes pulled up at the fence, leaning forward in his saddle with an oily smile. "Well, well. Didn't think you had it in you to play nursemaid Mercer. Thought you preferred your quiet." Cash set the hammer down carefully, stepping closer to the fence but not crossing it. His voice came low and even. "You're not welcome here." Hayes's gaze slid past him to where Josie still knelt by the garden, her shoulders squared, though her knuckles were white on the handle of her hoe. "Girl's mine. Bought her fair until you decided to get noble. I got papers to prove it. She's no one's property." Cash said each word deliberate. "Not mine. Not yours." The 2 riders behind Hayes shifted in their saddles, the creak of leather punctuating the silence. One rested his hand near the butt of his revolver, testing the air. Cash didn't move, but the stillness around him seemed to sharpen like the moment before lightning. "That ain't how the law sees it," Hayes drawled. "You want to keep her, maybe we settle this civil. I'll take her off your hands before you waste more feed on her." Cash stepped forward until the fence rail was pressed against his thighs. "You set foot past that line," he said, "and you'll answer to me." For a moment it was as if the air itself held still. Josie could feel her heartbeat in her throat, her breath coming short. She thought of the auction block, of the way Hayes's eyes had crawled over her then, and felt her grip tighten on the hoe. The rider to Hayes's right made a sudden move toward his holster. Cash's rifle was leveled before the man's fingers brushed the grip. The sound of its lever snapping into place cracked across the yard like a whip. "Try it," Cash said, his voice gone cold enough to burn. The man's hand froze. No one moved. Hayes spat into the dust. "You're gonna put yourself in the ground over some dirt rag girl. She ain't worth the trouble." Cash's eyes never left his. "I'd die on this land before I let you take what little piece it's got left." Josie felt something break loose inside her at those words. She rose from her knees, stepping forward until she stood just behind Cash's shoulder. "I'm not going back," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. Hayes looked at her for a long moment, then sneered. "You'll beg to come back when he's through with you." "She's free," Cash said, the edge in his voice now threaded with something heavier than anger. "And I don't care what you think you paid. You want her, you'll have to go through me." The line was drawn. Everyone knew it. Hayes's smirk faltered just enough for the satisfaction to register in Cash's eyes. With a sharp tug on the reins, he turned his horse. "You'll regret this, Mercer." "I already got enough regrets," Cash replied. They rode off in a haze of dust, their silhouettes shrinking against the horizon until only the wind remained. Josie let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands still shook, but it wasn't from fear anymore. She looked up at Cash. "You didn't have to?" "Yes." He interrupted, his tone firm but quiet. "I did. Because no one ever did it for me." She didn't answer, but something in her chest shifted, not quite safety yet, but the first step toward it. The weeks after Benton Hayes's visit passed without another rider cresting the ridge, but the memory of that standoff lingered in the air like the scent of a storm that had only just blown over. Life on the ranch settled again into its quiet rhythms, but something between Cash and Josie had shifted. The wary silence of those first days had softened. She still kept her words measured, but when she spoke, they came with a little less weight, as though each one didn't have to be tested before she dared to give it away. The small square of earth behind the cabin had transformed under her care. What had once been stubborn, cracked dirt now held neat rows of bean sprouts and squash vines that curled like green ribbons toward the sun. In the evenings, Cash would find her there crouched low, dirt streaked up her forearms, humming to herself as she loosened the soil around the roots. She never called him over to look, but he went anyway, standing a few paces off, nodding at the changes he saw. The cabin itself began to change too. At first it was subtle, a folded quilt draped over the back of his chair, a neat stack of kindling beside the stove. Then came small bundles of herbs tied with twine hanging from the rafters, their scent of rosemary and mint filling the air. The place that had once echoed with the hollow quiet of a man living alone now felt inhabited. They began sharing meals more often, and though conversation stayed sparse, the silences no longer felt like barriers. One evening, after a day spent mending a section of fence washed out by a spring storm, Cash came in to find a plate waiting on the table, roasted squash from her garden, cornbread baked in the cast-iron skillet. She didn't announce it or wait for praise, just slid the plate toward him and took her seat. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I wanted to." It wasn't much, but to Cash it was more than the words. It was choice. On cooler nights, they found themselves on the porch, watching the stars wake in the darkening sky. Josie would point upward, asking the names of constellations, and he'd tell her Orion, Cassiopeia, the Pleiades, the same ones his father had taught him. Once, after tracing Orion's belt with her fingertip, she murmured, "He looks lonely." "Most of the strong ones are." Cash said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Sometimes he caught her studying him the way she studied the stars, like she was trying to understand the shape of something that had been there long before she arrived. And he found himself doing the same, noticing how she no longer flinched when he walked past, how her steps around the cabin were surer now, no longer tentative. There were small moments, almost accidental, that spoke louder than anything else. Like the morning he returned from the barn to find his coffee already poured steam curling in the cool air, or the day he brought in a bucket of fresh water and found her mending the sleeve of his work shirt, the rip stitched so neatly it looked almost new. She didn't ask permission. She just did it as if the fabric were as much hers to care for as his. One late afternoon, while repairing a gate latch, Cash caught sight of her in the distance, crouched near the stream that marked the edge of his land. She was gathering smooth stones, turning them over in her hands before placing them in a small pile beside her. Later, he noticed them lining the edge of her garden bed, marking the border like a low wall. It wasn't for protection, he realized, it was for beauty. And that more than anything told him she was starting to see this place as her own. They didn't talk about the day Hayes came or the auction before it. The past seemed to sit between them, quietly acknowledged, but not picked apart. Instead, they spoke in the language of shared work and unspoken agreements that he would keep her safe and she would keep the place alive. Cash didn't know when it happened exactly, but one morning as he stepped outside, coffee in hand, and saw Josie kneeling in the garden with the sunrise spilling over her shoulder, he realized he'd stopped thinking of her as a guest. She wasn't passing through. She was part of the ranch now, part of the mornings, part of the quiet, part of the reason he found himself looking forward to the day ahead. What they had wasn't friendship, in the way most folks meant it. It wasn't family either, not yet. But it was steady, and for two people who'd learned the hard way how easily things could be taken steady, was a rare and valuable thing. The day Malcolm Crowder rode into Cash Mercer's yard, the air felt wrong before the first hoof struck the earth. Morning chores had just settled into their rhythm. Cash in the barn loft, tossing hay. Josie crouched in her garden, pulling weeds from between the squash vines. The sun was sharp and white overhead, the kind that bleaches the prairie of its colors, and the air carried no wind at all. Stillness like that never lasted in these parts. It began with the low rolling thud of hooves. Josie's hands froze mid-motion, her pulse leaping in her throat. Behind her, Cash straightened from his work, a coil of rope still in one hand. He stepped out into the glare, his eyes narrowing toward the rise. 3 riders came into view. At the front was Crowder, the name alone enough to sour the air, broad in the saddle, his black hat pulled low, a dark coat snapping faintly against his legs. He sat his horse like he thought the land bent for him every inch of him, carrying the weight of a man too used to getting his way. Flanking him were 2 hard-eyed men whose hands hovered too near their guns to be mistaken for casual. Crowder reined in a few yards from the fence, his mouth pulling into something between a grin and a sneer. "Well now," he drawled, his voice sliding oily over the distance. "Didn't figure I'd find my runaway girl playing house with a dirt farmer." Cash didn't move from where he stood, the rope loose in his grip. "She's not your girl," he said, each word steady as if hammered into place. "And she's not running anymore." Crowder laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You think taking in damaged goods makes you a hero, Mercer? I got papers say she's mine, bought and paid. That don't just vanish because you felt soft one day." Josie was on her feet now, the garden hoe in her hand, like it had grown there. Her shoulders were tight, her jaw set. But inside the old fear was curling hot and suffocating. Cash took a slow step forward, closing the space to the fence. "That contract you're holding on to, it's built on fear and shame. Those tools don't work here." One of Crowder's men swung a leg over boots, hitting the dirt with a thud. His hand brushed the grip of his revolver. Cash's own hand dropped toward his side, not in a rush, not in panic, just a clear, deliberate motion. His eyes didn't leave Crowder's. "I said she's not going with you. She's not worth the blood you're about to spill," Crowder said, his tone sharpening. Cash's jaw flexed. "She's worth it to me." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy enough to still even the flies. Josie felt them in her bones like a hammer strike cracking something open inside her. No one had ever said that before, not to her, not about her. Crowder's lip curled. "You got a death wish." Mercer Cash's gaze was unblinking. "Only if it comes from letting you take her." The man on the ground took a step forward, but he didn't get far. The rope in Cash's hand uncoiled with a snap, looping clean around his wrist before he could draw. One sharp tug yanked him sideways, his revolver clattering into the dirt. Crowder's horse shied at the sudden movement, dancing back a few steps, and the other rider's hand hesitated over his own weapon. Cash didn't raise a gun. He didn't need to. The steadiness in his stance and the cold iron in his voice were more dangerous than the rifle leaning against the porch. "This land," he said, voice carrying in the still air, "isn't just mine anymore. It's hers. You want to come for it. You better bring more than paper and bluster." Crowder's eyes went narrow, the muscles in his jaw ticking. "You'll regret this," maybe Cash said, "but not today." For a long moment, the only sound was the snort of Crowder's horse and the slow shift of leather. Then, with a sharp pull on the reins, he wheeled his mount around. His men followed, one nursing his wrist, the other keeping his eyes fixed anywhere but on Cash. They rode back over the ridge, their dust trailing behind them like a shadow that refused to lift. Josie's grip on the hoe loosened. She stepped toward Cash, her knees feeling unsteady, though her voice came out clear. "You didn't have to?" "Yes," he cut in, eyes still on the ridge where Crowder had disappeared. "I did, because no one ever did it for me." She stood there breathing in the warm, charged air between them, realizing that what just happened wasn't only about keeping her safe. It was about claiming something neither of them had dared believe in before the right to stand their ground together. The days that followed Malcolm Crowder's departure slipped into a rhythm that felt entirely different from the uneasy weeks before. The air on the ranch no longer carried the same taut wire of waiting for trouble. Instead, mornings arrived with a kind of quiet that seemed earned, not borrowed. The smell of fresh coffee drifting from the stove, the soft scrape of Josie's boots across the porch as she stepped out to greet the day. Spring had been slow to reach the plains that year, but when it came all at once. Patches of green pushed through the brittle earth, and Josie's garden swelled with life. Squash blossoms opened like yellow stars in the early light, and bean vines twisted upward as if chasing the sun itself. She tended them with the same care she'd once used to guard her own thoughts, her fingers gentler now, her shoulders not quite so tight. The cabin had changed too. What had once been little more than shelter now bore the small, unmistakable marks of a lived-in home. A quilt pieced together from mismatched fabric she'd traded for in town hung over the back of Cash's chair. The air carried the scent of drying herbs, bundles of lavender and mint swinging gently from the rafters. On the porch sat two rocking chairs, their placement so natural it was hard to remember there had only been one. Cash noticed other things smaller, but somehow more telling. Josie no longer kept her few belongings in a neat bundle by the door. She no longer paused before lighting the stove as if waiting to be told she couldn't. Her voice, once sparing and measured, came more freely now, a question about the weather, a remark about the cattle, even a quiet laugh when one of the hens pecked at his bootlaces. One evening, after a long day repairing the barn roof, they sat side by side on the porch without speaking. The sky was burning down into bands of orange and lavender, the last light catching in the dust motes drifting from the yard. Josie's fingers were stained from tomatoes. Cash's hands bore fresh blisters from the hammer. But neither seemed to mind the ache. The silence between them had grown thick in a good way, like the soil before planting. "Wasn't sure I'd ever want someone here again," Cash said finally, his eyes on the horizon. "Wasn't sure I could." Josie turned to look at him. "And now—" He didn't turn his head. "Now I check the stove in the morning to see if your bread's baking. I listen for you humming while you work. I find myself waiting for things I thought I never wanted back." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. "I used to think I'd never belong anywhere. Just move from one place to the next, hoping not to be noticed too much." Cash finally met her gaze. "You're not passing through, Josie. You're part of this place now." The words settled between them like a stone dropped in a still pond, ripples spreading outward. Inside, the fire crackled. The table held 2 mugs instead of 1. On the wall above the door hung an old horseshoe, one Cash's late wife had once claimed brought luck. He hadn't touched it in years, not until Josie had been here long enough to change the feel of the place. The grief still lived in him. It always would, but it no longer hollowed him out. Now, when his hand went to the locket in his pocket, it wasn't to chase what was gone, it was to remember without breaking. Josie had changed too. She no longer startled at every unexpected sound. Once she even laughed so hard she had to lean against the corral fence, all because Cash had been chased across the yard by a particularly territorial goose. He hadn't minded the embarrassment. It was the first time he'd heard her joy fill the air without hesitation. They hadn't spoken much about the future. There were no grand plans or promises carved into stone. But it was there anyway, growing quietly in the steady work of the garden, in the warm bread, cooling on the windowsill, in the small ways they made room for each other without asking. One afternoon, Josie came to him with a small tin in her hands. Inside were sunflower, lavender, and marigold seeds. "I want to plant something just for beauty," she said. Cash didn't ask why. He only said, "We'll make room." It wasn't the kind of love that stories made loud. There were no sweeping declarations or stolen kisses under the stars. But there was a rhythm to their days now, a rhythm built from trust earned and kept from two people choosing every day not to walk away. Josie no longer felt like someone who'd been rescued. Cash no longer felt like a man left behind. What they had was quiet, steady, and real. The kind of bond that holds fast when the wind turns cold, when the world grows hard, and when spring finally comes again. In the end, what Cash Mercer and Josie Harper built together didn't look like the kind of tale folks in town would whisper about over coffee. There were no dramatic rescues after the first day, no parades of gratitude, no sudden transformations under the glare of public approval. What grew between them was quieter, steadier, the sort of change that takes root in silence and deepens before anyone realizes it's there. They were two people shaped by loss, each carrying scars the other didn't try to erase. Cash never asked her to explain the years before he found her on that auction block, and Josie never pried into the parts of his past he kept locked away behind long stares and the lines around his eyes. They didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed. Instead, they learned the weight and worth of simply staying. In the slow rhythm of shared work and unspoken understanding, trust began to fill the spaces where fear used to live. Josie's flinch at sudden sounds gave way to the ease of moving through a home she no longer believed she'd lose. Cash's guarded mornings softened into something almost domestic. 2 cups of coffee on the stove instead of a loaf of bread cooling on the windowsill. The sight of her garden spilling green into the dusty yard. These were small things, invisible to anyone looking for grand gestures, but to them they were proof. Dignity could be rebuilt one quiet day at a time. Kindness here wasn't pity. It was recognition. Cash didn't see a burden when he looked at Josie, and she didn't see a savior when she looked at him. He saw a young woman with a will stronger than the ground she coaxed life from. She saw a man who had once been hollowed out by grief and still found the courage to stand between her and the men who would take her back. They met each other, not as broken halves, but as whole people choosing daily not to walk away. The world outside their fence would always have its Bentons and Crowders men who believed worth could be tallied in coins or claimed on paper. But inside that fence was a different kind of law, the law of earned trust of safety, that didn't need locking doors of respect, that didn't demand repayment. If you passed the cabin in the evening, you might see them on the porch, not touching, not speaking, just watching the prairie fade into night. If you came at dawn, you might find her kneeling in the dirt, planting seeds, some for food, some just for beauty, while he mended a fence nearby. And if you looked closely, you'd see what they knew, without needing to say they were no longer living parallel lives under the same roof. They were building something together, even if it was only meant for the two of them. Their story is proof that redemption doesn't always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it comes like the slow thaw of spring in the scrape of a chair across the porch, in the careful stitching of a torn shirt, in the decision to stand and not yield. It reminds us that the smallest acts, a quiet defense, a space made safe, a shared silence, can be the lifelines that pull someone back from the edge. Cash and Josie didn't find their peace in grand declarations or in erasing the past. They found it in the courage to look at each other without fear, in the steadiness of staying put when the rest of the world said to move on. And in that steadiness, they discovered the rarest thing the harsh West could offer a home that wasn't just a place, but a person. If this story moved, you don't forget to like, subscribe, and share Whispers of the West. Every tale we tell honors the quiet strength, redemption, and resilience of forgotten voices. Join us each week for more stories that linger long after the lanterns go out. Your support keeps these whispers alive.